The Sovereign Ledger, Hard Truths on Wealth Autonomy and the New Economy, written and published by Mindset Academy. Part 1. There was a time, not very distant in the memory of civilization, when the architecture of financial life appeared simple enough that a person could move through it with a quiet confidence. The advice passed down from one generation to another sounded almost sacred in its certainty. Work diligently, spend with restraint, save 10% of your income, and over time the slow machinery of prosperity would carry you towards stability and freedom. For decades, this formula seemed to function well enough that few paused to question its foundations. Entire cultures organized their expectations around this quiet promise that patience, discipline, and modest savings would eventually produce security. Yet the citizen of the modern economy now finds themselves standing in a world that bears little resemblance to the one in which that promise was first made. The economic terrain has shifted beneath the feet of millions, though the language of the old advice still echoes through classrooms, financial blogs, and family conversations as if nothing had changed. Wages may appear larger on paper, careers may carry impressive titles, and incomes may stretch into six figures that once symbolized undeniable prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet anxiety grows. People earning more money than previous generations often find themselves feeling no closer to genuine financial freedom. The paradox of being broke on six figures is not merely a matter of individual budgeting errors or lack of discipline. It is the result of a deeper transformation within the global economy, a transformation that has altered the relationship between labor, currency, assets, and time itself. To understand why saving 10% is no longer enough in the modern world, one must first step back and examine the silent forces reshaping the economic environment in which individuals now attempt to build their lives. For much of the 20th century, economic growth unfolded in a manner that allowed individuals to accumulate wealth gradually through wages alone. Housing remained relatively affordable compared to income, education was accessible without life-altering debt, and the purchasing power of money declined slowly enough that traditional saving strategies could still protect long-term financial security. In such an environment, disciplined saving truly could create stability because the rules of the system move slowly and predictably. But the modern economy moves with a different rhythm, one defined not by gradual shifts but by rapid acceleration. Technology reshapes industries in years rather than generations. Capital moves across borders at the speed of digital networks. Housing markets surge far beyond wage growth, and the cost of essential services expands faster than most incomes can realistically keep pace with. In this environment, the old formula begins to reveal its weakness. Saving 10% of income may still reflect discipline, but discipline alone cannot overcome structural shifts in the economic landscape. When inflation steadily erodes purchasing power, when assets appreciate faster than wages, and when financial markets increasingly reward ownership rather than labor, the individual who relies solely on saving risks falling further behind despite their best intentions. The uncomfortable truth is that the economy has quietly divided participants into two broad categories: those who primarily earn money through labor and those who primarily grow money through ownership. Labor remains essential, honorable, and necessary for society to function. Yet the modern financial system disproportionately rewards those who control assets. Businesses, real estate, intellectual property, and financial investments that generate returns independent of daily effort. This shift creates a silent but powerful imbalance. A professional earning a respectable six-figure salary may feel financially successful, yet if that income is entirely dependent upon continuous work, while their expenses rise alongside inflation and lifestyle expectations, their financial stability remains fragile. Meanwhile, individuals who accumulate productive assets allow time and capital to work in partnership, gradually building financial independence through the compounding effects of ownership. The sovereign ledger, the true accounting of personal economic power, therefore cannot be measured merely by income. It must be measured by autonomy. the degree to which one's life is controlled by wages versus assets, by obligation versus choice. Income may determine how comfortably one lives today, but assets determine how freely one can live tomorrow. This realization often arrives as a shock to those who follow the traditional financial path with sincerity and discipline. Many discover that despite earning more money than their parents ever did, they remain bound by mortgages, student debt, rising living costs, and a constant need to maintain their current income simply to preserve their existing lifestyle. The appearance of prosperity masks a deeper vulnerability. The sovereign individual, the one who seeks true autonomy in the modern economy, must therefore begin with a different understanding of wealth. Wealth is not the number printed on a paycheck, nor the prestige attached to a professional title. Wealth is the accumulation of resources that continue to generate value, even when one is no longer actively working. This distinction transforms the entire philosophy of money. Instead of asking how much one can earn this year, the sovereign thinker asks how much ownership can be built over time. Instead of measuring success by salary alone, they measure it by the growing independence created through assets, investments, and intellectual property that produce income beyond personal labor. Yet this transformation requires more than financial knowledge. It requires a shift in mindset. Many individuals unconsciously adopt the psychological patterns of the employee economy, where stability is expected to come from external institutions, companies, governments, pension systems, and financial products designed by others. But the emerging economic reality demands a new orientation, one in which individuals assume greater responsibility for designing their own financial structures. This is not a call for reckless risk-taking or speculative behavior, but rather a call for deliberate awareness. The sovereign ledger begins when one starts to track not only expenses and savings, but the deeper flow of financial energy within one's life. Where does income originate? How dependent is it on continuous effort? What percentage of one's resources is being directed toward assets capable of producing long-term value? When these questions are examined honestly, many people discover that their financial strategies were built for a different era, one in which slow inflation, stable employment, and predictable markets made traditional advice efficient. The modern world, however, rewards adaptability, ownership, and strategic thinking far more than passive saving alone. This is why the statement, saving 10% is no longer enough, should not be interpreted as an attack on discipline, but as a recognition of economic evolution. The rules have changed quietly and steadily, while much of society continued repeating the strategies of a previous generation. To build true financial sovereignty in the modern age requires a broader vision, one that includes income generation, asset acquisition, strategic investment, and the cultivation of skills that remain valuable in a rapidly changing marketplace. It requires individuals to see themselves not merely as workers within an economy, but as architects of their own financial systems. The sovereign ledger, therefore, becomes more than a record of money. It becomes a philosophy of autonomy, a deliberate effort to reclaim control over one's economic life in a world where traditional pathways to security are gradually eroding. And as more individuals awaken to this reality, a quiet transformation begins to unfold, one in which people move beyond the illusion that higher income alone guarantees freedom, and begin instead to pursue a deeper and more resilient form of wealth, one rooted not in wages, but in ownership, foresight, and the deliberate construction of financial independence. For the modern citizen navigating the new economy, this shift is not optional. It is the beginning of a necessary evolution in how wealth, work, and freedom are understood in an era where the old financial map no longer reflects the territory upon which the future will be built. Part 2. If the first awakening in the modern economy is the realization that income alone cannot guarantee financial freedom, the second awakening is even more unsettling, for it reveals that many of the financial systems surrounding ordinary citizens were never designed to create widespread autonomy in the first place. They were built, rather efficiently, to create stability within the broader economic machine, ensuring that labor continues to flow, consumption continues to rise, and the engines of productivity remain fueled by millions of individuals who work tirelessly in pursuit of security that often remains just beyond their reach. For generations, the structure of financial life was presented as a ladder. One was told that if they climbed steadily, education first, career advancement next, then modest savings and eventually retirement, each step would bring them closer to independence. Yet, what many have begun to discover is that the ladder itself has changed shape. The steps remain visible, but the distance between them has grown wider, the climb steeper, and the rewards at the top less certain than they once appeared. The modern professional who earns six figures often discovers that their financial obligations have grown just as rapidly as their income. Housing markets in major cities demand a significant portion of earnings. Education loans linger long after degrees have been framed and hung on the wall. Insurance, healthcare, childcare, and the countless invisible costs of maintaining a modern lifestyle quietly expand until even a respectable salary begins to feel strangely insufficient. What emerges is a condition that might be called the illusion of prosperity. From the outside, the individual appears successful, earning well above average, occupying a respected professional position, and participating fully in the culture of modern consumption. Yet internally, the balance sheet reveals a different story. Obligations tied tightly to income, savings growing slowly relative to inflation, and very little genuine autonomy over time. This is where the concept of the sovereign ledger becomes indispensable. Unlike the superficial financial scorecards that dominate social perception, salary figures, job titles, visible purchases, the sovereign ledger measures something deeper and far more revealing: control over one's time and economic destiny. When examined through this lens, many individuals begin to see that high income can sometimes function as a sophisticated form of dependency. A person earning a large salary but bound to demanding work schedules, high fixed expenses, and minimal asset ownership may actually possess less autonomy than someone earning less but investing consistently in income-generating assets that gradually reduce reliance on labor. The new economy has quietly shifted its rewards away from participation and toward ownership. This shift is perhaps the single most important economic transformation of the modern era, yet it is rarely explained in plain language. In the past, productivity gains often translated into rising wages for workers across industries. Today, however, technological leverage and global capital flows allow enormous value to accumulate within the structures of ownership. Corporations, intellectual property, platforms, and financial markets, while wages struggle to keep pace. In practical terms, this means that the individuals who control or invest in productive assets benefit disproportionately from economic growth, while those who rely exclusively on earned income must continually work harder simply to maintain their relative position. This structural reality explains why many diligent professionals feel as though they are running on a treadmill that gradually accelerates beneath their feet. They work harder, earn more, and yet somehow remain in roughly the same financial position year after year. The system is not necessarily broken in a mechanical sense. It continues to produce wealth at extraordinary levels, but the distribution of that wealth increasingly favors those who participate in ownership structures rather than labor alone. The sovereign thinker responds to this reality not with frustration, but with adaptation. Complaining about the system does little to change its mechanics. Understanding the system, however, creates the opportunity to navigate it intelligently. This begins with a shift in the fundamental question individuals ask about their financial lives. Instead of asking, "How can I earn more money?" the more powerful question becomes, "How can I convert earned income into ownership?" This subtle shift in perspective transforms the entire approach to wealth building. Every dollar earned is no longer seen merely as spending power, but as potential capital, a seed that can be planted into assets capable of growing independently over time. Assets take many forms. Some individuals pursue ownership in businesses, where profits can expand beyond the limits of personal labor. Others invest in real estate, allowing property to generate income while appreciating in value. Some focus on financial markets, carefully acquiring shares in companies whose productivity multiplies the value of invested capital. Still others build intellectual assets, books, digital platforms, software, or educational products that continue producing value long after the initial work has been completed. What unites these approaches is the principle of leverage. The sovereign individual seeks to build systems where time and effort, once invested, continue producing returns without requiring constant repetition of labor. This is the true essence of modern wealth. Not working harder forever, but building structures that gradually reduce the necessity of working at all. Yet this transition cannot occur overnight, nor does it emerge without patience and discipline. The early stages often feel slow and uncertain. When one first begins converting income into assets, the returns may appear small compared to the immediate comfort that spending could provide. It requires a long view, a willingness to delay gratification in exchange for the gradual construction of financial autonomy. The individual who masters this perspective begins to see the economy differently from the average observer. Instead of perceiving only jobs and salaries, they begin to notice flows of value, businesses generating revenue, properties producing rent, intellectual creations generating royalties, investments compounding quietly through time. Where others see expenses, the sovereign thinker sees opportunities for ownership. Where others see only risk, the thoughtful investor sees calculated possibility. This mindset does not eliminate uncertainty from financial life, but it does transform the nature of risk itself. Relying entirely on a single source of income, no matter how prestigious the job, can be more dangerous than gradually building diversified streams of ownership that continue producing value regardless of one's employment status. Thus, the paradox becomes clear. True security in the modern economy often comes not from stability alone, but from strategic diversification and ownership. Over time, as assets begin to grow and compound, the individual notices a subtle but powerful shift in their relationship to work. Labor becomes a choice rather than an obligation. Opportunities can be evaluated based on alignment and purpose rather than financial necessity alone. This is the beginning of real autonomy, the condition in which one's life is not dictated entirely by the need to maintain income, but guided by the freedom to choose how time, energy, and creativity are directed. Such autonomy cannot be purchased instantly, nor is it distributed evenly by society. It must be built deliberately, patiently, and often quietly, through decisions that may appear unremarkable in the present but accumulate extraordinary consequences over the long arc of time. And so the sovereign ledger continues to evolve, recording not only the numbers associated with wealth, but the deeper transformation occurring within the individual who learns to navigate the new economy with awareness rather than assumption. For those who understand this shift, the question is no longer whether 6 figures is enough. The real question becomes far more powerful. How quickly can income be transformed into ownership, and how intentionally can ownership be used to construct a life of genuine financial sovereignty? Part 3. As the individual continues to examine the deeper structure of the modern economy, another uncomfortable yet liberating truth gradually reveals itself. The primary battle for financial sovereignty is not fought in the marketplace, the stock exchange, or the real estate market, but within the architecture of the human mind. For although the economic system has undeniably changed in its incentives and rewards, the psychological patterns guiding most individuals remain anchored in a world that no longer exists, a world where stability was assumed, where institutions were trusted to secure the future, and where the passage from education to employment to retirement unfolded along a relatively predictable path. The modern citizen inherits these assumptions early in life, often without realizing that they are assumptions at all. Education systems, social expectations, and cultural narratives quietly reinforce the belief that financial progress follows a straightforward formula: acquire credentials, obtain employment, demonstrate reliability, and gradually climb a professional ladder whose rungs promise increasing income and eventual security. For a time, this framework may appear to function adequately. Careers begin, salaries grow, and the outward signs of adulthood, apartments, cars, professional attire, and the rituals of workplace life, create the comforting illusion that the system is operating exactly as it should. Yet somewhere along the journey, a subtle tension emerges. The individual notices that despite years of diligent work and increasing income, The sense of financial freedom remains elusive. Expenses seem to rise with every promotion. Obligations multiply in proportion to earnings. The lifestyle associated with success begins to demand the very income that was supposed to create independence. What was once perceived as progress slowly begins to resemble a carefully constructed loop, a cycle in which greater income simply sustains a larger version of the same dependency. This phenomenon is not accidental. It is a result of what might be called the architecture of financial gravity, the set of social, psychological, and economic forces that gently but persistently pull individuals toward patterns of consumption that match their income. Human beings are deeply influenced by their surroundings. When one's peers live in certain neighborhoods, drive particular vehicles, travel to certain destinations, and send their children to certain schools, the invisible pressure can become extraordinarily powerful. What begins as a modest desire for comfort and belonging gradually evolves into a lifestyle whose maintenance requires continuous effort. A person earning six figures may find themselves living in environments where such income is not exceptional but expected, where the cost of participation in social and professional circles quietly escalates until even substantial earnings feel insufficient. Thus, the individual becomes trapped not by poverty, but by expectation. The prison is not built from scarcity, but from the silent agreement that success must look a certain way, that prosperity must be displayed through visible consumption, and that deviation from this pattern somehow signals failure. The sovereign thinker recognizes this dynamic with increasing clarity and begins to ask a question that few people dare to consider. What the most powerful form of wealth is not what one displays, but what one quietly builds. This question marks the beginning of a profound psychological shift. Instead of seeking validation through visible consumption, the individual begins to value invisible accumulation. The focus moves away from appearances and toward the silent construction of assets that gradually expand autonomy. Such a transition requires unusual discipline, for it often means living differently from those within one's immediate environment. While others upgrade homes, vehicles, and lifestyles with each increase in income, the sovereign individual may choose a quieter path, directing a significant portion of earnings toward investments, businesses, and intellectual assets that will compound over time. To the casual observer, this restraint may appear unnecessary or even puzzling. After all, why earn a large income if not to enjoy the visible rewards of success? Yet the sovereign thinker understands something deeper. Consumption provides temporary satisfaction, but ownership provides enduring freedom. The difference between these two paths becomes clearer as time passes. Consumption requires constant renewal. A luxury purchase a day soon becomes ordinary, replaced by the desire for something newer or more impressive. Ownership, by contrast, has the potential to expand quietly in the background, generating value year after year, while demanding relatively little additional attention. This is why many individuals who appear outwardly wealthy remain financially fragile, while others who live modestly accumulate extraordinary autonomy over time. The difference lies not in income, but in orientation, whether one's financial energy flows primarily toward consumption or toward ownership. The modern economy, with its relentless marketing and social comparison, strongly encourages the first path. Every advertisement, every social media image, and every cultural narrative celebrates visible success while rarely acknowledging the quiet discipline required to build lasting wealth. Yet the sovereign ledger records only what truly matters: assets, autonomy, and the ability to shape one's life without constant financial pressure. To cultivate this orientation requires the development of a new relationship with money itself. Instead of viewing money merely as a tool for purchasing comfort or status, the individual begins to see it as stored opportunity, a resource capable of creating systems that generate future value. Each dollar saved and invested becomes a worker, quietly laboring on behalf of the individual long after the original effort that produced it has ended. Over time, these financial workers multiply, creating an expanding network of assets that gradually reduces the need for continuous labor. The mathematics of this process are simple but powerful. When income is spent entirely on consumption, financial progress remains tied to the limits of human energy and time. When income is converted into assets, however, the system begins to operate according to principles of compounding, where growth builds upon previous growth in an accelerating pattern that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. This is the hidden engine of wealth creation in the modern world. It is not dramatic, glamorous, or widely understood, but operates with quiet reliability for those who align their financial behavior with its logic. The sovereign individual therefore approaches each financial decision with a deeper awareness of long-term consequence. A purchase is no longer evaluated solely by its immediate pleasure, but by its opportunity cost, the assets that could have been created with the same resources. This perspective does not demand a life devoid of enjoyment or comfort. Rather, it introduces balance. Some resources may be directed toward experiences and pleasures that enrich life, while others are carefully invested in the structures that will gradually create independence. Over time, this balance produces a remarkable transformation. The individual who once depended entirely on a paycheck begins to notice that a portion of their income now originates from investments, properties, businesses, or intellectual creations. At first, these streams may appear small, almost symbolic, but with patience they grow stronger and more reliable. Eventually, a moment arrives when the flow of income from assets begins to rival the income generated through labor. At that point, the architecture of life begins to change in profound ways. Work becomes a choice rather than a necessity. Time becomes more flexible. Decisions can be made according to values and aspirations rather than financial urgency. This is the moment when the sovereign ledger begins to reflect genuine autonomy, the quiet but powerful condition in which an individual is no longer entirely dependent on the economic structures surrounding them. The journey toward this state is neither quick nor effortless, but is accessible to those willing to rethink the psychological patterns inherited from previous generations. For in the modern economy, the greatest obstacle to financial sovereignty is not the absence of opportunity, but a persistence of outdated beliefs about how wealth is created. And the individual who learns to transcend those beliefs, replacing them with a deliberate philosophy of ownership, patience, and disciplined investment, gradually transforms their relationship with the economy itself, moving from participant to architect, from laborer to owner, from financial dependence toward genuine autonomy in a world where the rules of wealth have quietly evolved. Part 4. As the sovereign thinker advances deeper into the realities of the modern financial landscape, a sobering recognition gradually emerges, one that few institutions speak about openly, but which quietly governs the outcomes of millions of lives. Time, not money, is a true currency of existence, and the economic structures within which people operate determine who ultimately gains control over that currency. The individual who believes they are pursuing wealth often discovers, sometimes too late, that what they were truly exchanging was not simply effort for income, but hours of life for temporary financial relief. In earlier economic eras, this exchange appeared fair enough. A stable career could reliably transform decades of work into a retirement period during which the individual might finally enjoy the fruits of their labor. Yet in the accelerated environment of the modern economy, where industries evolve rapidly, pensions have largely vanished, and the cost of living escalates faster than traditional saving strategies can compensate for, this exchange begins to reveal its hidden imbalance. The sovereign ledger therefore records a deeper calculation than the one most individuals track. It does not merely ask how much money one earns or saves, but how efficiently one's time is being transformed into long-term autonomy. The person who earns a large salary but must remain indefinitely tied to a demanding job in order to maintain their financial obligations may possess high income, but very little sovereignty over their own hours. Conversely, an individual who gradually constructs streams of income independent of daily labor begins to reclaim portions of their time, piece by piece, until the structure of life itself begins to shift. This relationship between time and money lies at the heart of the new economy. Technological advancement has created unprecedented opportunities for leverage, allowing certain individuals and organizations to produce enormous value with relatively small teams or even single creators. A software developer can build a product used by millions. An educator can distribute knowledge globally through digital platforms. A writer, artist, or entrepreneur can create intellectual assets that continue generating revenue long after the original effort has been completed. These examples illustrate a principle that has quietly become central to modern wealth creation: scalability. Labor alone scales poorly because each additional dollar earned generally requires additional hours of work. Assets, however, possess the ability to scale in ways that human labor cannot. Once created, a valuable asset can often be distributed, rented, or replicated many times over with minimal additional effort. The sovereign individual, therefore, begins to look at the world through the lens of leverage. They observe not only what work produces income today, but what activities might produce assets capable of generating value tomorrow. The distinction is subtle yet transformative. A job may pay well, but if it requires constant presence and effort, its long-term impact on autonomy may be limited. A carefully constructed asset, however, may require intense effort initially while eventually producing returns for years or even decades. This shift in perspective does not diminish the importance of work. Rather, it reframes the role that work plays within the broader strategy of life. Work becomes the engine that generates the capital necessary to build assets. The paycheck becomes not the final reward of effort, but the raw material from which future independence can be constructed. Unfortunately, many individuals never reach the stage of awareness because they become trapped in what might be called a consumption loop. As income rises, lifestyle expands to absorb the additional resources. Larger homes require larger mortgages. More expensive neighborhoods introduce higher social expectations. Luxuries gradually transform into perceived necessities until the entire financial structure of life becomes dependent on maintaining a certain level of income. In such a condition, even impressive earnings fail to produce genuine freedom. The individual may appear prosperous to observers, yet their financial life functions like a delicate machine that must be constantly powered by labor. Should that income stream falter, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. The sovereign thinker recognizes this trap early and begins to construct life differently. Rather than allowing lifestyle expansion to consume every increase in income, they direct a substantial portion of that growth toward assets capable of producing long-term returns. This decision may appear conservative or even restrictive in the short term, yet over time it creates a powerful divergence between those who consume their income and those who convert it into ownership. Years pass, and the consequences of these choices begin to compound. The individual who prioritizes consumption must continue working at full intensity to maintain their lifestyle. The individual who prioritized ownership begins to notice that their investments, businesses, or intellectual properties are quietly producing income independent of daily labor. The most profound moment arrives not when wealth becomes visibly impressive, but when dependence on labor begins to weaken. Perhaps a rental property covers a portion of monthly expenses. Perhaps dividends from investments begin contributing meaningful income. Perhaps a digital product or business produces revenue that continues flowing long after the original work has been completed. At first, these streams appear modest, but they carry a deeper significance. Each dollar earned without direct labor represents a fragment of reclaimed time. Each asset-producing income expands a margin of choice within the individual's life. Over time, this margin widens. The person who once needed to work endlessly simply to sustain their lifestyle begins to realize that their assets now support a portion of their existence. Work can be reduced, redirected, or reimagined according to purpose rather than necessity. This transformation is not merely financial. It is psychological. When individuals regain control over their time, their perception of life itself begins to change. Creativity flourishes where exhaustion once dominated. Curiosity replaces urgency. Relationships deepen because attention is no longer constantly divided between survival and obligation. The sovereign ledger thus reveals its true meaning. It is not simply an accounting of money, but an accounting of freedom. Every asset acquired, every investment made with patience and foresight, gradually shifts the balance of life away from compulsion and toward autonomy. Yet this path requires courage because it often contradicts the visible norms of society. The world celebrates consumption far more loudly than it celebrates restraint. It praises those who display wealth rather than those who quietly construct it. The sovereign individual must therefore operate with a different compass, guided less by public approval and more by long-term vision. To live this way is to accept that the most meaningful victories are often invisible for many years. While others chase immediate status, the sovereign builder plants seeds whose growth will only become evident in the future. And when those seeds mature, when assets produce income, when time becomes flexible, when life is guided by intention rather than necessity, the individual finally understands a deeper purpose of the sovereign ledger. It was never simply about accumulating money. It was about reclaiming the most valuable resource any human being possesses: the freedom to decide how one's limited time on earth will be spent. In the new economy, where technological acceleration and economic complexity continually reshape the landscape of opportunity, those who grasp this principle early gain an extraordinary advantage. They begin constructing systems that serve them rather than structures that enslave them, gradually transforming income into ownership, ownership into autonomy, and autonomy into a life that reflects not the demands of the system, but the deliberate vision of the individual who has learned to master it. Part 5. As the final understanding of the sovereign ledger settles into the mind of the modern thinker, a quiet but unmistakable clarity begins to form, one that reframes the entire pursuit of wealth, work, and autonomy in the new economy. For after examining income, ownership, time, and leverage, the individual eventually arrives at the deepest realization of all. The modern economic landscape does not reward comfort nearly as much as it rewards awareness. Those who simply follow inherited financial habits often remain trapped within systems designed for a previous era, while those who observe carefully, adapt deliberately, and construct their financial lives with intention begin to experience a form of autonomy that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. This final realization does not come with fireworks or dramatic announcements. Instead, it arrives gradually, like the slow sunrise over a landscape that had previously been hidden in darkness. One begins to see how the economic world actually functions beneath the surface narratives repeated by institutions, media, and cultural tradition. Income alone is revealed as fragile when unaccompanied by ownership. Saving without investment becomes insufficient when inflation quietly erodes purchasing power. Hard work, though admirable and necessary, proves incapable of producing sovereignty unless it is paired with systems that allow value to multiply beyond the limits of personal effort. The sovereign ledger therefore becomes a philosophy of awareness, a disciplined commitment to observing the deeper currents that shape the flow of wealth within the modern world. It asks individuals to examine their lives not only through the lens of what they earn today, but through the more powerful lens of what they are building for tomorrow. At the beginning of the journey, most people measure financial progress through simple numbers: salary increases, bonuses, and perhaps the modest growth of a savings account. These metrics appear logical because they are immediate and easily understood. Yet, as a sovereign thinker matures, these measurements begin to feel incomplete. Income, after all, disappears the moment it is spent. Savings remain vulnerable to inflation. Even prestigious careers can vanish in the face of technological disruption, economic downturns, or shifting industry demands. True financial strength, the sovereign individual realizes, is not measured by what flows through one's hands, but by what remains working quietly in the background long after the immediate effort has passed. Assets become the silent architecture of autonomy, the invisible structures that allow life to gradually shift away from dependence on constant labor. Yet perhaps the most profound transformation occurs not in one's bank accounts, but in one's relationship with fear. Many people remain trapped within financial systems they privately distrust because they fear stepping beyond the familiar patterns that society presents as safe. They hesitate to invest, reluctant to risk money they work hard to earn. They hesitate to build businesses, worried that failure might disrupt the stability they currently possess. They hesitate to explore unconventional paths because the opinions of others weigh heavily upon their decisions. The sovereign thinker eventually recognizes that this fear, while understandable, often functions as the final barrier between dependence and autonomy. For the new economy rewards those who are willing to learn, experiment, and adapt far more than it rewards those who simply follow instructions written for an earlier generation. This does not mean recklessness or blind risk-taking. On the contrary, sovereignty requires discipline, research, and patience. It demands that individuals understand the tools available within the financial system, investments, businesses, intellectual property, digital leverage, and ownership structures, and apply them thoughtfully over time. The goal is not rapid wealth built on speculation, but steady autonomy constructed through informed decision-making and long-term strategy. Once this mindset takes hold, an interesting psychological shift begins to occur. The individual stops chasing income alone and begins designing financial ecosystems. Instead of asking how much money can be earned this year, they ask how many systems can be built that will continue producing value in the future. Instead of viewing work as a permanent obligation, they begin viewing it as a capital-generating phase of a larger plan, a phase that funds the construction of assets capable of eventually replacing the need for that labor. Gradually, the ledger begins to change. What once consisted solely of wages and expenses now contains investments, ownership stakes, creative assets, and opportunities that extend far beyond a single job or industry. The financial life of the individual begins to resemble a network rather than a pipeline, a system of interconnected streams rather than a single fragile source. This is the quiet beginning of autonomy. Autonomy does not mean abandoning work entirely, nor does it require extravagant wealth. Rather, it represents the ability to make decisions without the constant pressure of financial survival dictating every move. It means choosing projects because they align with purpose rather than necessity. It means adjusting one's pace of life without fearing immediate economic collapse. It means reclaiming the freedom to think long-term in a world that constantly demands short-term reactions. In the modern era, where technological change reshapes industries faster than ever before, this autonomy becomes increasingly valuable. The individual who relies entirely on a single job may feel secure today, yet vulnerable tomorrow. The individual who has gradually built multiple forms of ownership, investments, businesses, intellectual property, or digital systems, possesses resilience that allows them to navigate change with far greater confidence. And so the sovereign ledger reaches its final lesson. Wealth is not the accumulation of money alone, but the construction of optionality. It is the ability to adapt when the world changes, to pivot when opportunities arise, and to protect one's time from systems that demand endless participation. The modern economy will continue evolving, perhaps faster in the coming decades than it has in the past century. Artificial intelligence, digital infrastructure, global capital flows, and decentralized technologies will reshape the way value is created and distributed. In such an environment, those who cling rigidly to outdated financial models may find themselves perpetually reacting to change. But those who cultivate the mindset of the sovereign ledger, those who observe carefully, invest deliberately, and build ownership patiently, will find themselves navigating the future with increasing clarity. They will understand that the goal was never merely to earn a six-figure salary, nor to follow financial rules written for a world that no longer exists. The goal was always autonomy, the quiet power to design one's life intentionally rather than inherit it by default. And as the pages of the sovereign ledger continue to fill with the results of disciplined thought, strategic ownership, and patient investment, the individual finally sees the truth that was hidden at the beginning of the journey. Saving 10% was never wrong. It was simply incomplete.